Some restless spirits do not depart in peace because they cannot, or will not. Tonight's story is Clay Shuttered Doors by Helen Hull. 'Tis now the very witching time of night, when churchyards yawn and hell itself breathes out contagion to this world. Ah, now could I drink hot blood and do such bitter business as the day would quake to look upon. That's Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 2. Line 388 for those keeping track. Yes, the grave. The grave. That place where no one wants to be, but everyone will go. Makes it sound a bit like the family reunion from hell, doesn't it? Restless spirits abound here, from those who cannot go to their rest to those who will not stay there, with an ill-favored assortment of those who willfully or otherwise go about disturbing them. Some, of course, do not depart in peace because they cannot or will not. Perhaps it's unfinished business that detains them, a bargain made, a promise unfulfilled, perhaps a desperate yearning, their own or another's, knots that otherwise severed golden thread. Tonight? Tonight we continue our journey through the ancient Lick Gate and cross the kirkyard with Clay Shuttered Doors. It's from 1926 by Helen Hull. Love may be eternal, but lovers are mortal. Well, aren't they? For months I have tried not to think about Thalia Corson. Anything may invoke her, with her languorous fragility, thin wrists and throat, her elusive face with its long eyelids. I can't quite remember her mouth. When I try to visualize her sharply, I get soft, pale hair, the lovely curve from her temple to chin, and eyes blue and intense. Her boy Fletcher has eyes like her. Today I came back to New York, and my taxi to an uptown hotel was held for a few minutes in Broadway traffic, where the afternoon sunlight fused into a dazzle of great expanse of plate glass and elaborate show motor cars. The Regal 8, Winchester Corson's establishment. I huddled as the taxi jerked ahead in spite of the knowledge that Winchester would scarcely peer out of that elegant setting into taxicabs. I didn't wish to see him, nor would he care to see me. But the glimpse that had started the whole affair churning again, and I went through it deliberately, hoping that it might have smoothed out into some rational explanation. Sometimes things do if you leave them alone, like logs submerged in water that float up later, encrusted thickly. This affair won't add to itself, though. It stays unique and smooth, sliding through the rest of life without annexing a scrap of seaweed. I suppose, for an outsider, it all begins with the moment on Brooklyn Bridge. Behind that are the years of friendship with Thalia. Our families had summer cottages on the Cape. She was just enough older, however, so that not until I had finished college did I catch up to any intimacy with her. Thalia had married Winchester Corson, who at that time fitted snugly into the phrase a rising young man. During those first years, while his yeast sent up preliminary bubbles, Thalia continued to spend her summers near Boston, with Winchester coming for the occasional weekends. Fletcher was unintentionally born there. Fletcher began his difficult existence by arriving as a 7-month baby. 2 years later, Thalia had a second baby to bring down with her. Those were the summers which gave my friendship to Thalia its sturdy roots. They made me wonder, too, why she had chosen Winchester Corson. Winchester was personable enough, I guess. Tall, with prominent dark eyes, and full mouth under a great neat mustache, restless hands, and an uncertain disposition. He could be a charming companion, sailing the catboat with Dash, managing lobster parties on the shore. Or sometimes Winchester would unaccountably settle into a foggy grouch, when everyone, children and females particularly, was supposed to approach him only on tiptoe, bearing burnt offerings. The last time Winchester spent a fortnight there, before he moved the family to the new Long Island estate, I had my own difficulties with him. There had always been an undertone of sex in his attitude towards me, but I had thought that's just his male conceit. That summer he was a nuisance, coming upon me with his insistent messy kisses, usually with Thalia in the next room. They were the insulting kind of kisses that aren't at all personal, and I could have ended them fast enough if there hadn't been the complication of Thalia and my love for her. If I made Winchester angry, he would put an end to Thalia's relation to me. I didn't anyway want her to know what a fool he was. Of course, she already knew what a fool Winchester was, but I thought then, foolishly, that I could protect her. There are, I have decided, 2 ways with love. You can hold one love, knowing that if it's a living thing, it must develop and change. That takes maturity and care and consciousness for the other person. That was Thalia's way. Or you enjoy the beginning of love, and once you're past that, you have to hunt for a new love because the excitement seems to be gone. Men like Winchester, who use all their brains on their jobs, never grow up. They go on thinking that preliminary stir and snap is love itself. Yes, cut flowers. That was Winchester's idea. Well, to Thalia, love was a tree. Anyway, I said Brooklyn Bridge was the point at which the affair had its start. It seems impossible to begin there. Or anywhere, as I try to account for what happened. 10 years after the summer when Winchester made himself such a nuisance, that last summer the Corsons spent at the Cape, I went down at the end of the season for a week with Thalia and the children at the Long Island place. Winchester drove out for the weekend. The children were mournful because they didn't wish to leave the shore for school. A sharp September wind brought rain and fog down the Sound, and Winchester nourished all that Sunday a disagreeable grouch. I had seen nothing of them for most of the 10 intervening years, as I had been first in France and then in China after a feature article stuff. The week had been pleasant. Good servants, comfortable house, a half-moon of white beach below the drop of lawn. Thalia, a stimulating listener, with Fletcher, a thin, eager boy of 12. Like her in his intensity of interest. Dorothy, a plump, pink little child of 10, had no use for stories of French villages or Chinese temples. And there was Nug. Yes, little Nug, the wire-haired terrier. Her dolls were more immediate and convincing. Thalia was thin and non-committal, except for her interest in what I had seen and done. I couldn't, for all my affection, establish any real contact. Thalia spoke casually of the townhouse, of dinners she gave for Winchester, of his absorption in his business affairs. But Thalia was sheathed in polished aloofness and told me nothing of herself, really. She did say one evening that she was glad I was to be in New York that winter. Winchester, like his daughter Dorothy, had no interest in foreign parts once he had ascertained that I hadn't even seen the Chinese quarters of the motor company in which he was concerned. Winchester had an amusing attitude towards me. Careful indifference, no doubt calculated to put me in my place as no longer alluring. Thalia tried to coax him into listening to some of my best stories. "Tell him about the bandits, Mary." But his sulkiness brought after dinner a casual explanation from her, untinged with apology. "Oh, he's working on an enormous project, dear, a merging of several companies, and he's so soaked in he can't come up for breath, you know." In the late afternoon, the maid set out high tea for us, before our departure for New York. Thalia suggested that perhaps one highball was enough if Winchester intended to drive over the wet roads. Yes, but Winchester immediately mixed a second, and then a third, asking if she had ever seen him in the least affected. "Be better for you than the tea before a long damp drive, too, eh?" He chuckled, annoyingly, and then he clinked the ice in his glass. "Jazz you up a bit, Nug, the little terrier, was begging for food, and Thalia, bending to give him a corner of her sandwich, apparently did not hear Winchester. He looked about the room, a smug, owning look. The fire and the candlelight shone in the heavy wax rafters, made silver beads of the rain on the French windows. I watched him. Heavier, more dominant, his prominent dark eyes, his lips sullen, as if the whiskey banked up his temper rather than appeased it. Then Jim, the gardener, brought the card at the door. The children scrambled in. Dorothy wanted to take Nug, but her father said not if she wanted to sit with him and drive. "How about the chain, sir?" Jim held the umbrella for Thalia. "That's too damned noisy. We don't need tire chains." Winchester slammed the door and slid under the wheel. Thalia and I, with Fletcher between us, sat comfortably in the rear. "I like it better when Walter drives, don't you, Mother?" said Fletcher as we slid down the drive out to the road. "Shh. Father likes to drive, and Walter likes Sundays off, too. Thalia's voice was cautious. It's too dark to see anything. Oh, I can see lots, announced Dorothy, whereupon Fletcher promptly turned the handle that pushed up the glass between the chauffeur's seat and the rear. The heavy car ran smoothly over the wet, narrow road, with an occasional rumble and flare of headlights as some car swung past. Not until we reached the turnpike was there much traffic. There Winchester had to slacken his speed for other shiny beetles slipping along through the rain. Sometimes he cut out past a car, weaving back into line in the glaring teeth of a car rushing down on him, and Fletcher would turn inquiringly toward his mother. The gleaming wet darkness and the smooth motion made me drowsy, and I paid little heed until we slowed in a congestion of cars at the approach to the Brooklyn Bridge. Far below on the Black River, spaced red and white stars suggested slow-moving tugs, and beyond faint lights splintered in the rain hinted at the city. Oh, let's look for the cliff dwellers, Mom. Thalia leaned forward, her fine, sharp profile dimly outlined against the shifting background of the arches, and Fletcher slipped to his feet, his arm about her neck. There! We were reaching New York end of the bridge, and I had a swift glimpse of their cliff dwellers, lights in massed buildings like ancient campfires along a receding mountainside. Just then Winchester nosed out of the slow line. Dorothy screamed. The light from another car tunneled through our windows. The car trembled under the sudden grip of brakes, and like a crazy top, spun sickeningly about with a final thud against the stone abutment. A shatter of glass, a confusion of motor horns about us, and a moment while the tautness of shock held me rigid. Around me in that periphery of turmoil, the usual recriminations. What the hell you think you're doing? The shriek of a siren on an approaching motorcycle. Within the circle, I tried to move across the narrow space of the car. Fletcher was crying, vaguely. I knew that the door had swung open, and Thalia was crouching upon her knees, the rain and the lights pouring on her head and shoulders. Her hat was gone, her wide fur collar looked like a drenched and lifeless animal. Hush, Fletcher! I managed to force the movement into my stiff body. Are you hurt, Thalia? Then outside, Winchester, with a bristling fury of panic, was trying to lift her drooping head. Thalia! My God! You aren't hurt! You aren't! Someone focused a searchlight on the car as Winchester got his arms about her and lifted her out through the shattered door. Over the springy line of the stone arch, I saw the cliff dwellers. Fires, I thought as I scrambled out to follow Winchester. She was leaning forward, looking at those. That terrific spin of the car must have knocked her head down on the doors that lurched open. Lay her down, man! Lay her down! An important little fellow had rushed up, a doctor evidently. Lay her down, you fool! Someone threw down a robe, and Winchester, as if Thalia were a drowned feather, knelt with her, laid her there on the pavement. I was down beside her, and a fussy little man also. She did look drowned in that beating sea of tumult, that terrific honking of motors, unwilling to stop an instant even for... what, was it death? Under the white glare of headlights, her lovely face had the empty shallowness, the husk-likeness of death. The little doctor had his pointed beard close to her breast. He lifted one of her long eyelids. She's just fainted, right, Doctor? Winchester's angry voice tore at him. The little man rose slowly. She's your wife? I'm sorry. Death must have been instantaneous. A blow on her temple it was. With a kind of roar, Winchester was down there beside Thalia, lifting her, her head lolling against his shoulder, his face bent over her. Thalia! Thalia, do you hear me? Wake up! I think he even shook her in his baffled fright and rage. Thalia, do you hear me? I want you to open your eyes. You weren't hurt. That was nothing. Open your eyes. And then, dearest. Oh, dearest, you must. And more words, frantic, wild words, mouth close to her empty face. I touched his shoulder, sick with pity, but he staggered up to his feet, lifting her with him. Fletcher pressed, shivering against me, and I turned for an instant to the child. Then I heard Thalia's voice, blurred and queer. Call me, Win? You called? And Winchester's sudden triumphant laugh. She was standing against his shoulder, still with that husk-like face, but she spoke again. You did call me. Hey, let's get out of this. Winchester was again the efficient, competent man of affairs. The traffic cops were shouting. The lines of cars began to move. Winchester couldn't start his motor. Something had smashed. His card and a few words left responsibility with an officer. And even as an ambulance shrilled up, he was helping Thalia into a taxi. "You take the children, will you?" And to me, You, get her another taxi, will you?" To the officer. He closed the taxi door after himself and was gone, leaving us to the waning curiosity of passing cars. As we rode off in a second taxi, I had glimpsed of the little doctor, his face incredulous, his beard wagging as he spoke to the officer. Dorothy was, characteristically, tearfully indignant that her father had left her to me. Fletcher was silent as we bumped along under the elevated tracks. But presently he tugged at my sleeve, and I heard his faint whisper. "What is it, Fletcher?" "Is my mother really dead?" "Of course not, Fletcher. You saw her get into the cab with your father." "Why didn't Daddy take us too?" wailed Dorothy, and I had to turn to her, although my nerves echoed her question. The house door swung open even as the taxi bumped the curb, and the bunter hurried out with an umbrella which we were too draggled to need. "Mr. Coulson instructed me to pay the man, madam." He led us into the hall, where a waiting maid popped the children at once into the tiny elevator. "Will you wait for the elevator, madam? The library is one flight." The butler led me up the stairs, and I dropped into a low chair near the fire, vaguely aware of the long, narrow room with discreet gold of the walls giving back light from the soft lamps. "I'll tell Mr. Coulson you have come." Is Mrs. Coulson... Does she seem all right?" I asked. "Quite, madam. It was a fortunate accident with no one hurt." Well, perhaps it had addled my brain. I waited in kind of numbness for Winchester to come. Presently he strode in, his feet silent on the thick rugs. Sorry, he began abruptly. "I wanted to look the children over, not to scratch on them. If you're all right, of course, eh?" "Oh, yes, but Thalia..." "She won't even have a doctor. I put her straight to bed. She's so damn nervous, you know. Hot water bottles. She was cold. I think she's asleep now. Said she'd see you in the morning, right? You'll stay here, of course." He swallowed and gulped the whiskey he had poured. "Have some, Mary? Or would you like something hot?" No, Win. No, thanks. If you're sure she's all right, I'll just go to bed." "Sure?" "Did that damn fool on the bridge throw a scare into you?" "Well, he gave me a bad minute, I'll say. If that car hadn't cut in on me... I told Walter last week the brakes needed looking at. They shouldn't grab like that. Might have been serious." Well, since it wasn't, then..." I rose wearily, watching him pour the amber liquid slowly into his glass. If you have someone, show me my room." "After Chinese bandits, a little skid ought not to matter to you." His prominent eyes gleamed hostilely at me. He wanted some assurance offered that the skidding was not really his fault, that only his skill had saved all our lives. "So, I can't see Thalia, then?" I asked. "She's asleep. Nobody can see her." His eyes moved coldly from my face, down to my muddy shoes. Yeah. Better give your clothes to the maid for pressing. You're smeared quite a bit, aren't you, Mary?" I woke early, with clear September sun at the windows of the room, with the blue sky behind the sharp city contours beyond the windows. There was none too much time to make the morning train for Albany, where I had an engagement that day, an interview for an article. The maid who answered my ring insisted on serving breakfast to me in a borrowed elegance of satin negligee. Mrs. Coulson was resting, and would see me before I left. Something, the formality, the luxury, the complicated household so unlike the old days at the Cape, accented the queer dread which had filtered all night through my dreams. I saw Thalia for only a moment. The heavy silk curtains were drawn against the light, and in the dimness her face seemed to gather shadows. "Are you quite all right, Thalia?" I hesitated beside her bed, as if my voice might tear apart the veils of drowsiness in which she rested. "Why, yes," as if she wondered. Then she added, so low I wasn't sure what I heard, "It's so hard to get back in." "What, Thalia?" I bent toward her. "Oh, I'll be myself once I've slept enough." Her voice was clearer now. "Come back soon, won't you, Mary?" Then her eyelids closed and her face merged into the shadows of the room. I tiptoed away, thinking she slept. It was late November before I returned to New York. Freelancing has a way of drawing herrings across your trail. And when I might have drifted back in early November, a younger sister wanted me to come home to Arlington for her marriage. Oh, I had written to Thalia, first a note of courtesy for my week with her, and then a letter begging for news. Like many people of charm, Thalia wrote indifferent letters, and stiffs and childlike, lacking in her personal quality. Her brief reply was more unsatisfactory than usual, though. The children were away at school. Lots of cold, rainy weather. Everything was going well. At the end, in writing quite unlike Thalia's, as if she scribbled the line in haste, "I am lonely. When are you coming again?" I answered that I'd show up as soon as the wedding was over. That night, I reached Arlington. It was rainy, too, and I insisted upon a taxi equipped with chains. My brother thought that was amusing, and at dinner gave the family an exaggerated account of my caution. I tried to offer him some futile sisterly advice and to point up my remarks. I told him about that drive from Long Island with the Corsons. I'd never spoken of it before. I found that an inexplicable inhibition kept me from making much of a story. "Well, nothing happened, did it?" Richard was triumphant. A great deal might have," I insisted. "Thalia was stunned, and I was disagreeably startled." "Thalia was stunned, was she?" An elderly cousin of ours from New Jersey picked out that item. I saw her fitting it into some pigeonhole, but she said nothing until late that evening when she stopped at the door of my room. "Dear, have you seen Thalia Corson lately?" she asked me. "Why, no, I haven't been up in New York since September," I replied. She closed the door and lowered her voice, a kind of avid curiosity riding astride the decorous pitch she expressed. "Dear, I called there," she explained, "one day last week. I didn't know what was the matter with her. I had not heard of the accident." I waited, an old antagonism for my proper cousin blurring the fear that shot up through my thoughts. "Your Thalia was always individual, of course." She used the words like a reproach. "But she had a savoir-faire. But now she's, well, queer. Do you suppose her head was affected?" "How is she queer?" I asked. "Oh, well, she looks miserable, too. Thin and white." "But how—" "I'm telling you, Mary, she was quite rude. First she didn't come down for ever so long, although I sent up that word that I'd come up to her room if she was resting. Then her whole manner, well, I was really offended. She scarcely heard a word I said to her. She just sat there with her back to a window, so I couldn't get a look at her myself. And when I said, 'You don't look like yourself,' she actually sneered at me. 'Myself,' she said. 'How do you know?' Imagine, I tried to chat along as if I'd noticed nothing, but, well, my dear, I flatter myself I can manage awkward moments rather well. But Thalia sat there, and I am sure she muttered under her breath. Finally, I rose to go, and I said, meaning well, 'You'd better take a good rest. You look half dead.' Mary, I wish you'd seen the look she gave me. Really, I was frightened. Just then the little dog came in, you know, Dorothy's little terrier, Toto. No, Nug, I think, actually. Thalia used to be silly about him. Well, she actually tried to hide in the folds of the curtain, and I don't wonder. The dog was terrified at her. He crawled on his belly out of the room. Now she must have been cruel to him if he acts like that. I think Winchester should have a specialist. I didn't know how to account for any of it, but of course a blow on the head can affect a person." Fortunately, my mother interrupted us just then, and I didn't, by my probable rudeness, give my cousin reason to suppose the accident had affected me, too. I sifted through her remarks, and I decided that they might mean only that Thalia found her more of a bore than usual. Lord knows I usually did. As for Toto, Nug, perhaps he retreated from the cousin. Anyway, during the next few days, the house had so much wedding turmoil that she found a chance only for a few more dribbles. One that Thalia had given up all her clubs, that she had belonged to several. Another that she had sent the children to boarding schools instead of keeping them at home. "Just when her husband's doing so well, too," she went on. I was glad when the wedding party had departed, and I could plan to go back to New York. Personally, I think a low-caste Chinese wedding is saner and more interesting than a modern American affair. My cousin should think I could stay
Come stay home with the family, she says. And couldn't we go to New York together if I insisted upon gadding off?
We couldn't. I saw to that. She hoped that I'd look up Thalia. Maybe I could advise Winchester about a specialist.
I did telephone as soon as I got in. That sentence, "I am lonely," in her brief note kept recurring. Her voice sounded thin, remote. A poor connection, I thought. She was sorry. She was giving a dinner for Winchester that evening. The next day, perhaps? I had piles of proof to wade through the next day, and it was afternoon when I finally went to the Corson house. The butler looked doubtful, but I insisted, and he left me in the hall while he went off with my card. He returned a little smug in his message. Mrs. Corson was resting and had left word that she must not be disturbed. Well, you can't protest to a perfect butler, you know. And as I started down the steps, indignant, when a car stopped in front of the house, a liveried chauffeur opened the door, and Winchester emerged. He glanced at me in the twilight and extended an abrupt hand.
"Would Thalia see you?" he asked.
"No," I said. For a moment I hoped he might convoy me past the butler. "Isn't she well? Win, she asked me to come here today."
"Yeah, I'd hoped she would see you." Winchester's hand smoothed out his little mustache. "She's just tired from her dinner last night, I think. She overexerted herself. She was quite like the old Thalia all night, until we got home."
He looked at me slowly in the dusk, and I had a brief feeling that he was really looking at me. No, for me, for the first time in all our meetings, as if he considered me without relation to himself for once.
Come in again, will you?"
He thrust away whatever else he thought of saying.
"Thalia really would like to see you."
Can I give you a lift, Mary?" "No, Win, thanks. I need the walk." As I started off, I knew the moment had just missed some real significance. If I had ventured a question... but what, after all, could I ask Winchester? He had said that Thalia was just tired. That night I sent a note to Thalia, saying that I had called and asked when I might see her. She telephoned me the next day. Would I come in for Thanksgiving, she asked. The children would be home, and she wanted an old-fashioned day, everything but the sleigh ride New York couldn't furnish. Dinner would be at 6. For the children. Perhaps I could come in early. I felt a small grievance at being put off for almost a week, but I promised to come anyway. That was the week I heard gossip about Winchester, in the curious, devious way of gossip. Atlantic City, a gaudy lady, someone having an inconspicuous fortnight of convalescence there had seen them. I wasn't surprised, except perhaps that Winchester chose Atlantic City. Thalia was too fine. He couldn't grow up to her. I wondered how much she knew. She must, years ago, with her sensitiveness, have discovered that Winchester was stationary so far as love went, and being stationary himself, was inclined to move the object toward which he directed his passion. On Thursday, as I walked across Central Park, gaunt and deserted in the chilly afternoon light, I decided that Thalia probably knew more about Winchester's affairs than gossip had given me. Perhaps that's why she had sent the children away. Win had always been conventionally discreet, but discretion would be a tawdry coin among Thalia's shining values. I was shown up to the nursery with a message from Thalia that she might join me there soon. Fletcher seemed glad to see me in a shy, excited way, and stood close to my chair while Dorothy wound up her phonograph for a dance record and pirouetted about us with her doll. "Mother keeps her door tight locked all the time," whispered Fletcher doubtfully. "We can't go in. This morning I knocked, but no one answered." "Do you like your school?" I asked him cheerfully. "I like my home better." His eyes, so like Thalia's with their long arched lids, had young bewilderment under those lashes. "See me!" called Dorothy. "Watch me do this!" While she twirled, I felt Fletcher's thin body stiffed against my arm, as if a kind of panic froze him. Thalia stood in the doorway. Was the boy afraid of her? Dorothy certainly was not. She cried out, "See me, Mother! Look at me!" In her lusty confusion, I had a moment to look at Thalia before she greeted me. She was thin, but she had always been that. She did not heed Dorothy's shrieks, but she watched Fletcher, a kind of slanting dread on her white, proud face. I thought that week on Long Island that she shut herself away from me, refusing to restore the intimacy of 10 years earlier. But now a stiff loneliness hedged her as if she were rimmed in ice and snow. She smiled. "Dear Mary," she said. At the sound of her voice, I lost my slightly cherished injury that she refused earlier to see me. "Let's go down to the library, Mary. It's almost time for the turkey." I felt Fletcher break his intent watchfulness with a long sigh. As the children went ahead of us, I caught at Thalia's arm. "Thalia," she drew away, and her arm, under the soft, flowing sleeve of that dull blue stuff, was so slight it seemed brittle. I thought suddenly that she must have chosen that gown because it concealed so much beneath its lovely embroidered folds. You aren't well, Thalia. What is it?" "I'm well enough. Don't fuss about me." And even as I stared reproachfully, she seemed to gather vitality, so the dry pallor of her face became smooth ivory, and her eyes were no longer hollow and distressed. "Come along, dear." The dinner was amazingly like one of our old holidays. Winchester wore his best mood. The children were delighted and happy. Thalia, under the golden flames of the tall black candles, was a gracious and lovely hostess. I almost forgot my troublesome anxiety, wondering whether my imagination hadn't been playing tricks on me after all. We had coffee by the library fire and some of Winchester's old chartreuse. Then he insisted upon exhibiting his new radio. Thalia demurred, but the children begged for a concert. "This is their party, Tally. Come on." Winchester opened the doors of the old teakwood cabinet which housed the apparatus. Thalia sank back into the shadows of a wing chair, and I watched her over my cigarette. Off guard, she relaxed into a strange apathy. Was it the firelight or my unaccustomed chartreuse? Her features seemed blurred, as if a clumsy hand trying to trace a drawing made uncertain outlines. Strange groans and whirs came from the radio. "Oh, Win, I can't stand it." Her voice dragged as from some great distance. Not tonight. I just can't stand it, Win." She swayed to her feet, her hands restless under the loose sleeves. "Static," growled Winchester. Wait a minute. No. Again it was as if vitality flowed into her. "Come, children. You've had your potty. Time to go upstairs. I'll go with you." They were well trained, I thought. Kisses for their father, a curtsy from Dorothy for me, and a grave little hand extended by Fletcher. Then Winchester came toward the fire as the three of them disappeared. "You're good for Thalia," he said in an undertone. "She's... well, what do you make of her, Mary?" "Why?" I fenced, unwilling to indulge him in my vague anxieties. "You saw how she reacted about the radio. It was just a bit of static. She has whims like that. Funny, she was herself at dinner. Last week she gave a dinner for me, an important affair, pulled it off brilliantly. Then she shut herself up and won't open her door for days. I can't make it out. She's thin. I mean, not as thin as Kira here is in Second Life, but she's thin, wasting away." Have you had a doctor in, Win?" "That's another thing. She absolutely refuses. She made a fool of me when I brought one here. She wouldn't unlock her door. She says she just wants to rest. But..." He glanced towards the door. You know that fool on the bridge, that little runt? Back the night of the accident. The other night, I swear I saw him rushing down the steps as I came home. Thalia just laughed at me when I asked her about it." Something clicked in my thoughts. A quick suspicion, drawing a parallel between her conduct and that of the people I'd seen in the East. Was it some drug? That lethargy and the quick spring into vitality, dazed behind a closed door? Mary, I wish you'd persuade her to go off for a few weeks. I'm frightfully pressed just now in an important business matter, but if she'd go off, maybe you'd go with her?" "Where, Winchester?" We both started with the guilt of conspirators. Thalia came slowly into the room. "Where shall I go? Would you suggest Atlantic City?" "Yes, perhaps, although some place further south this time of year." Winchester's imperturbability seemed to me far worse than some slight side of embarrassment. It marked him as so rooted in his successful deceit whether Thalia's inquiry were innocent or not. "If Mary would go with you, I can't get away just now, Tally." "I shall not go anywhere until your deal goes through." "Not at all, Win. Not till your deal goes through." But then... Thalia seated herself again in the wing chair. The hand she'd lifted to her cheek, fingers were just touching her temple beneath the soft drift of her hair, seemed transparent against the firelight. Have you told Mary about your deal? Winchester plans to be the most important man on Automobile Row. Don't you, Win? Was there mockery in her tone? I can't tell you the details, but he's buying out all the rest. Aren't you, Win?
Oh, don't be absurd. Not all of them. It's a big merging of companies, that's all.
We entertain the lords at dinner, and in some mysterious way that smooths the merging. It makes a wife almost necessary.
Invite Mary to the next shebang and let her see how well you do it. Winchester was irritated. For all your scoffing, there's as much politics to being president of such a concern as of the United States.
Yes, Win. I will invite Mary, and then she'll see that you don't really want to dispense with me. Not yet.
Good God, I meant for a week or two.
As Winchester, lighting a cigarette, snapped the head from several matches in succession, I moved my chair a little backward, distressed. There was a thin wire of significance drawn so taut between the two of them that I felt at any moment it might splinter in my face. It's so lucky, malice flickered on her thin face. It's so lucky that you weren't hurt in that skid on the bridge, Mary. Winchester would have just tossed you in the river to conceal your body.
If you're going to go over that again.
Winchester strode out of the room. As Thalia turned her head slightly to watch him, her face and throat had the taut rigidity of pain so great that it congeals the nerves. I was silent. With Thalia I had never dared to intrude except when she admitted me. In another moment she too had risen. You'd better go home, Mary. I might tell you things you wouldn't care to live with. I tried to touch her hand, but she retreated. If I had been wiser or more courageous, I might have helped her. I shall always have that regret, and that can't be much better to live with than whatever she might have told me then. All I could say was stupidly, Thalia, if there's anything I can do, you know I love you. Love? Love, what a strange word. And she laughed, and the quiet room was like the shrilling of a grasshopper on a hot afternoon. One thing I will tell you, she stood now on the stairway above me. Love has no power. Love has no power. It never shouts out across the great space. Only fear and self-desire are strong. And then she had gone, and the butler appeared silently to lead me to the little dressing room. The car is waiting for you, madam, he assured me, opening the door. I didn't want it, but Winchester was waiting too, hunched angrily in a corner. That's the way she acts. Now you've seen her. I'll talk about it. Thalia never bore grudges. You know that. It seems deeper than a grudge.
That's reference to the accident. That's a careless remark I made. I don't even remember just what I said. Something entirely inconsequential. Just that it was a damned lucky no one was hurt while I was putting this merger across. You know, if it'd gotten in the papers, it would have queered me. Wrecking my own car. The papers. There's always a suspicion you've been drinking. She picked it up and she wouldn't drop it. It's like a fixed idea. If you can suggest something. I wanted to see a nerve specialist. What does she do behind that locked door?
What about Atlantic City, Win? I asked abruptly. I saw his dark eyes bulge, trying to ferret out my meaning there in the dusky interior of the car.
A week there with you might do her good.
That was all he would say, and I hadn't courage enough to accuse him, even in Thalia's name.
At least you'll try to see her again, yeah?
The car stopped in front of my apartment house. I couldn't sleep that night. I felt that just over the edge of my squirming thoughts there lay clear and whole the meaning of it all, but I couldn't reach past thought. And then, stupidly enough, I couldn't get up the next day. Just a feverish cold, where the doctor insisted on a week in bed and subdued me with warnings about influenza. I'd begun to feel steady enough on my feet to consider venturing outside my apartment a week later when the invitation came for a formal dinner at the Corsons. Scrawled under the engraving was a line, "Please come, T." I sent a note explaining that I had been ill and that I should come. The dinner was a fortnight away, unless I stayed too wobbly. I meant that night to arrive properly with the other guests, but my watch, which had never before done anything except lose a few minutes a day, had gained an unexpected hour. Perhaps the hand stuck. Yes, perhaps. Well, I was told I was early. Thalia was dressing, and only the children home for the Christmas holidays were available. So I went again to the nursery. Dorothy was just as plump and unconcerned as ever. But Fletcher, young Fletcher, had a strained listening effect, and he looked too thin and white for a little boy. They were having their supper on a small table, and Fletcher kept going to the door, looking out into the hall. "Mother promised to come up," he said. The maid cleared away their dishes, and Dorothy, who was in a beguiling mood, chose to sit on my lap and entertain me with stories. One was about Nug the terrier. He'd been sent out into the country because Mother didn't like him any more. "I think," interrupted Fletcher, "she likes him, but he has a queer notion about her." "Nug does not. She does not like him at all," repeated Dorothy. Then she dismissed that subject, and Fletcher, too, for curiosity about the old silver chain I wore. I didn't notice if the boy had slipped away, but he must have gone downstairs, for presently his fingers closed over my wrist like a frightened bird's claw, and I turned to see him trembling, his eyes dark with terror. He couldn't speak, but he clawed at me, and I shook Dorothy from my knees, and I let him pull me out to the hall. "What is it, Fletcher?" He only pointed down the stairway toward his mother's door, and I fled down those stairs. What had the child seen? "The door wasn't locked," he gasped behind me. I opened it very still, and I went in." I pushed it ajar. Thalia sat there before her dressing table, with her threefold mirrors reiterating like a macabre symphony her rigid, contorted face. Her gown, burnished blue and green like a peacock's feathers, sheathed her gaudily in silver, blue and green chiffon clouded her shoulders. Her hands clutched at the edge of the dressing table. For an instant I could not move, thrust through with terror like the boys. Then I stumbled across the room. Before I reached her, the mirrors echoed her long shudder. Her eyelids dragged open, and I saw her stare at my reflection, wavering toward her. Then her hands relaxed, moved quickly toward the crystal jars along the heavy glass of the table. Without a word, she leaned softly forward to draw a scarlet line along her white lips. How cold it is in here, Thalia," I said stupidly, glancing towards the windows where the heavy silk damask drawn across lay in motionless folds. "Fletcher said—" I was awkward. I was an intruder. "He startled me." Her voice came huskily. She rouged her hollow cheeks. It was as if she drew another face for herself. "I didn't have time to lock the door." Then turning, she sought him out, huddled at the doorway like a moth on a pin of fear. "It wasn't nice of you, Fletcher. It's all right now. You see? Look at me. See? It's all right now." She rose, drawing her lovely scarf over her shoulders. "You should never open closed doors, son." She blew him a kiss from her fingertips. "Now run along and forget you were so careless." The icy stir of air against my skin had ceased. I stared at her, my mind racing back over what I knew of various drugs and the stigmata of their victims. But her eyes were clear and undilated, a little piteous even. This is the last time," she said. "I cannot endure it." And then with an amazing flood of vitality, as if a sudden connection had been made and current flowed again. "Come, Mary, it's time we were downstairs." I thought Fletcher peered over the railing as we went down, but a swift upward glance failed to detect him. The dinner itself I don't remember definitely, except that it glittered and sparkled, moving with a slightly alcoholic wit through elaborate courses, where I sat like an unabashed poor relation at a feast, unable to stop watching Thalia, wondering whether my week of fever had given me a tendency to hallucinations. At the end, a toast was proposed. A toast to Winchester Corset and his extraordinary success. "It's done, then." Thalia's gaiety had sudden malice as she looked across at Winchester, seating himself after a slightly pompous speech. "Sealed? Cemented forever. It's done, then." she repeated. And thanks to his charming wife, too, cried a plump, bald man, waving his glass. A toast to Mrs. Corson! Ha, ha, toast! Thalia rose, her rouge like flecked scarlet on white paper. One hand drew her floating scarf about her throat. Her painted lips moved without a sound. There was an instant of agitated discomfort as the guests felt their mood broken so abruptly, into which her voice pierced thin, high. I deserve such a toast? I pushed back my chair and reached her side. I'll take it. I saw Winchester's face, wine-flushed, angry rather than concerned. Come, Thalia. Don't bother. I'll be all right. I'll be all right now. But she moved ahead of me so swiftly that I couldn't touch her. I thought she tried to close her door against me. I was too quick for that. The silver candelabra still burned above the mirrors. Mary! Her voice was low again as she spoke a telephone number. Mary! Tell him at once. And she repeated the phone number for me. She stood away from me, her face a white mask, with spots of scarlet, her peacock dress a shimmer. I did as I was bid, and when I had said, Mrs. Corson wishes you at once, there was an emptiness on the other end of the line where a man's voice had come which suggested a sudden leap out of a room somewhere. I can never get in. I can never get in again. Her fingers curled under the chiffon scarf. Never. The black agony of fighting back. If he... She bent her head, listening. Go down to the door. Let him in, Mary, let him in. I crept down the stairs. Voices from the drawing room. Winchester was seeing the party through. Almost I reached the door and opened it. I found him there. The little doctor with the pointed beard that we had encountered on the bridge. He brushed past me up the stairs. He knew the way then. I was scarcely surprised to find Thalia's door fast shut when I reached it. Behind it came not a sound. Fletcher, like an unhappy sleepwalker, his eyes heavy, slipped down beside me, clinging to my hand. I heard farewells, cheering of taxis and cars. Then Winchester came up the stairs. She shut you out? He raised his fist and pounded on the door. I'm going to stop this nonsense. I sent for a doctor, I said. He's in there. Is it? His face was puffy and grey. Is it that same fool? Winchester hollered out. Then the door opened, and the little man confronted us. It is over, he said. What have you done to her? Winchester lunged toward the door, but the little man's lifted hand had dignity enough somehow to stop him. She won't come back again, the doctor spoke slowly. You may look if you care to, sir. What, she's dead? She's dead? She died. She died months ago, there on the bridge. But you called to her, and she thought you wanted her, for herself's sake, for who she was. She thought you called out in love, and she answered that call in love. But you didn't really, did you? You selfishly bemoaned not the loss of a wife, but of a fixture in your life, a semblance of a wife, because that's what's expected in your world of deals and commerce. Too late did she come to understand that you did not love her. Perhaps you're not capable of love. But Thalia stayed on to fulfill the mission for which you called her back from the grave, man. And now that mission has been fulfilled, and the poor woman's free to rest at last. Winchester thrust the little man aside and strode into the room. I dared one glance and saw only pale hair strewn and shining on the pillow. Then Fletcher flung himself against me, sobbing, hiding his face. I knelt to hold him close against the fear we both felt. What Winchester saw there, I never knew. But he hurled himself past us, down the stairs, screaming in agony. Remorse? Or was it simply terror? And Thalia, what was once my darling Thalia, was buried with the coffin lid fast closed under the flower wreaths.
You have just heard Clay Shuttered Doors by Helen Hull.
Thank you for listening to StoryLink Radio. If you like what you've just heard, we hope you will subscribe to our podcast and pass along our web address, www.storylinkradio.com. Be sure to visit our website for show notes, to find out how to join our live audience, and for lots of free stuff, including free audiobooks and much more. Join us next time for another story from StoryLink Radio.